Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being back with us this morning for the Music, Sound, and Antisemitism Symposium. We're so pleased to have you all with us, and we're looking forward to another very stimulating day of papers and conversation. This morning, we are going to begin with a paper by Miseo, who is from Hanyang University. She wins the prize for the farthest travels to get to us, so we're very grateful to you for making the trip. So without further ado, Hanyang, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks for kind introduction. Before I start, thanks to Jewish Music Forum and the Barry Brook Center for inviting me to speak at this symposium. And my English is not very fluent, so please understand kindly. Today, I will analyze Vincent Dindy's opera, L'étranger, through the figure of the Juif, the Wandering Jew. Through this, I will examine how anti-Semitism was constructed through music in France from the late 19th to early 20th century. The legend of the Wandering Jew has long served as a symbolic metaphor for the Jewish people scattered and living without a homeland. The Wandering Jew has appeared in many forms over time and is often blended with similar legends. Two essential traits define this figure. First, he must wander eternally, without rest, until the second coming. For the next trait, his wandering is framed as punishment, carried out according to Jesus' will. Another recurring element is added in some cases, which is the idea of redemption through love. In this idea, the wandering Jew can only be saved by the sincere love of a woman. Based on these features, the legend of the wandering Jew spread widely across Europe. The 19th century was the time when the figure of the Wandering Jew drew more attention than ever before in France. The French fascination with the Juif appeared in many forms of art, including literature, painting, and music. It is important to note that during this period, the symbolic meaning of the Wandering Jew began to change. Artworks such as I listed here, the Wandering Jew figure evokes not negative stereotypes, but sympathy for the suffering of a people condemned to eternal wandering. In short, until the mid-19th century, the emotional tone surrounding the figure was relatively positive, expressing sympathy and compassion for persecuted minority. In contrast, during the late 19th century, the Wandering Jew was reinterpreted as a symbol to justify negative traits associated with Jewish identity by focusing on the punishment inflicted upon him. From this period onward, the figure was understood less as a folklore subject, but more through internalized emotions such as pain, guilt, punishment, and self-pity. This turn from folklore to internal emotions was closely tied to domestic events in French society that shaped public perceptions of Jews, which in result caused anti-Semitism. There was three major causes for this formation of negative identity on Jewish people. The first major cause was the sharp increase in Russian Jewish immigration. The next was the Dreyfus Affair of 1894. Finally, there was a rise of medical theories that portrayed the Jews as psychologically weak people. Due to these causes, public debates about Jews turned Fangzieker France into a battleground of anti-Semitic discourse. Spontaneously, these debates also emerged as a major issue in the musical world. By the end of the 19th century, the negative perceptions associated with the Wandering Jew had become cultural symbols of anti-Semitism in music. I examined the case of Vincent d'Indy, a representative and anti-Semitic composer. Through this case, I will show how anti-Semitism was constructed within the French musical sphere at the turn of the century. The dominance of Jewish composers in the French opera scene during the early to mid-19th century reflected the social position of Jews in French society. Against this backdrop, the Dreyfus Affair of 1894 sharply divided the music world into supporters of Jews and anti-Semitic opponents. The rise of nationalism in the music scene was part of a broader movement asking, what is true French tradition? This question gained urgency after the Dreyfus Affair. Nationalist musicians considered Jewish composers as a disruptor of true French tradition and began to blame Jewish composers for obstructing the development of French music. This led to a wave of anti-Semitism in the French musical community. The composer who led these anti-Semitic attacks was Vincent d'Indy, who was well known as Wagnerian, right-wing, anti-Semitic figure in the French musical world. d'Indy was actively involved in the anti-Dreyfus party Ligue de la Patrie Française and maintained close ties with right-wing nationalists. The political ideology he developed through this involvement was later applied to music in the curriculum of the Schola Cantorum, the conservative music school he directed. In 1896, d'Indy founded the Schola Cantorum, a music school focused on religious music. He incorporated nationalist musical philosophy and the right-wing anti-republican ideologies of his patrons into the school's curriculum. Schola Cantorum encouraged Wagner's style, which d'Indy saw as similar to Gregorian chant. This stood in opposition to the Italo-Judaic style, represented by Jewish composers like Meyerbeer. d'Indy was deeply influenced by Richard Wagner. Wagner had criticized Jewish composers dominating the French opera scene and urged d'Indy to reform French national theaters. d'Indy accepted this advice and used the opera as a tool to promote nationalist ideas. Therefore, opera became the genre where Wagner's anti-Semitic influence is most evident in d'Indy's work. d'Indy's three operas, Webern, L'Étranger, and La Légende de Saint-Christophe, attempt to express Frenchness through Wagnerian style. Among them, L'Étranger has the main character represented as the eternal wanderer. Through this work, we can examine how d'Indy musically represents anti-Semitism through the wandering Jew figure. I analyzed how d'Indy expresses the wandering Jew in L'Étranger, focusing on both the libretto and the music. Dindy's second opera, L'étranger, The Stranger, is a two-act action musical that premiered in January 1903 at the Théâtre Royal de la Monnaie in Brussels. It begins with the arrival of the main character, the stranger, in poor fishing village. The stranger embodies the typical traits of the wandering Jew figure. By casting the stranger as a wandering Jew figure, Dindy reinforces negative stereotypes and perceptions of Jewish identity, such as moneymaker and libertine. First, the stranger's ability to catch many fish using magic rather than honest labor symbolizes the image of Jews and as dishonest moneymakers. Although he tries to share the fish with a poor fisherman, the villagers still see him as a cursed swindler who stole their catch. Second, the stranger reflects the stereotype of Jews as libertine, which was common in Europe at the time. He falls in love with a girl called Vita, who is almost 20 years younger than him and even already engaged with someone else called André. The worst part is that when the stranger realizes that his love cannot be fulfilled, he abandons Vita despite her deep devotion. In the end, Vita gives up a stable life with her fiancé and follows the stranger into death. These narratives present the stranger in a deeply negative light as moneymaker and libertine. The musical language of L'étranger is deeply influenced by Wagner's music. The most prominent example is Dindy's use of leitmotif technique. Dindy assigns a recurring leitmotif to the stranger, which appears throughout the opera. I refer to this motif as the stranger motif and analyze it from a harmonic perspective. I also compared it with the musical material of André, Vita's fiancé, who is portrayed as the stranger's opposite. A notable harmonic feature of the stranger motif is its use of double tonality. Every time when the motif appears, it can be interpreted into two different keys. This tonal duality creates ambiguity, which serves to characterize the figure. Specifically, the use of double tonality reflects the stranger's dual and contradictory nature. Due to his dual nature, the stranger is portrayed as an unknowable and mysterious, almost supernatural being. The stranger's negative traits reinforce negative perceptions of the wandering Jew, which was common stereotypes about Jews held by many Europeans at the time. One striking feature in the harmonic progression of the stranger motif is its use of chromatic-mediant relationships. Please see the red boxes. This harmonic relationship consistently appears each time the motif is repeated. Can you hear it? Oh. Stranger motif. And next. Interestingly, Wagner also used chromatic mediums in his leitmotifs to represent wandering figures. For example, in Siegfried, Wotan appears in disguise as a wanderer. In Act 2, the Wanderer's motif exhibits a chromatic medium relationship, and the same occurs in Act 3. Scott Murphy argues that chromatic mediums in Wagner's leitmotif convey hostility as a byproduct of eerie or ominous. This symbol is also applicable to the stranger. The chromatic medium relationship expresses the villager's hostility toward the stranger, who is seen as magical and threatening outsider. The characteristics of stranger symbolizing the Jew become more pronounced when contrasted with André, a character who represents Frenchness. André is a handsome customs officer admired by the village girls and is engaged to Vita. Unlike the aimless stranger, André is an ideal figure who can offer Vita a stable life. When he first appears in Act 1, he hums a chanson melody from offstage. At this moment, the meter shifts from duple to triple time. The 9/8 meter, often found in French folk songs, along with the narrow, repetitive melodic range, reflects a typical folk style. After briefly humming, André begins singing a full chanson with lyrics. The fact that André enters singing a French folk song is highly symbolic. Dindy believed that music could help establish national identity, and he found the answer in folk music. For him, French folk song represented the essence of French musical tradition. Therefore, having André sing a chanson suggests that Dindy viewed André as a symbolic representative of the French nation. The contrast between the stranger and André is also reflected in the use of voice versus instruments. The stranger motif is portrayed purely through instrumental sound, lacking any trace of human physicality. In contrast, André enters by singing la 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 la, and his voice reveals a sense of innocence and warmth. This contrast can be linked to each character's relation to humanity. The stranger, doomed to eternal life, defies the natural order. He has no name and is depicted as lacking a clear identity throughout the opera. André, on the other hand, represents a stable life within the social order. He brings joy and comfort to Vita's life. By pairing the stranger with instrumental music and André with vocal music, Dindy presents the stranger as a dehumanized figure and André as a symbol of French human character. As we have seen, Dindy uses the stranger motif not only in the libretto, but also in the music to continuously otherize the stranger. This otherization ultimately leads to anti-Semitism through the lens of the Wandering Jew. Dindy's operas were often criticized by the French press and public for their extreme right-wing ideology and strong Wagnerian influence. However, the anti-Semitic elements of his operas have rarely been addressed. His ideas were later adopted by French fascists in the 1930s and contributed to anti-Semitic sentiments during World War II. By having a renewed attention to his operatic works, we can have deeper understanding about historical context of anti-Semitism in late 19th century French society. That concludes my presentation. I'd be glad to hear your thoughts and questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Miseo, for a fascinating presentation. I'll bring the mic around to anyone who has questions. Does anyone want to start us off? Absolutely.
Thank you for that really wonderful presentation. I admire your boldness in going into the music and finding evidence musically of anti-Semitism in an opera where the word Jew, of course, is never mentioned. So Dandy was a terrible guy, and he gave you a lot to work with in his writings. And yet, despite that, he seems to be, as I'm guessing, a kind of revival of interest. And I've read some of the recent Dandy literature, and it seems to me very much to whitewash him and his anti-Semitism, and to say, well, you know, he wasn't that bad, and everybody was like that back then, and so on. So my question for you is, why? Why is there so much pushback now? Why is there such an attempt to whitewash Dandy?
Can you speak slowly and easily? I'm sorry.
I'm a New Yorker, so it's very hard for me to speak slowly. In the reception history of Dandy, what people have said about him, people can't ignore the terrible words that he said, but they would like to pretend that it doesn't really affect the music. And I think you're showing very clearly that the anti-Semitism is in the music. And I'm asking if you agree with me about that there's a lot of Dandy scholars who pretend that the anti-Semitism doesn't go into the music, and if you have thoughts about why that is.
You mean in Dandy's music, how anti-Semitism is represented? I think the interesting point is the Dandy's anti-Semitism is linked with the anti-Italianism, and because in early or mid-19th century French opera scene, there's a Meyerbeer and many Jewish composers, and they played the Italian operas in Paris opera scene, and Dandy saw that that's the problem, that Jewish composers played the Italian opera, and he saw the anti-Semitism as equal to anti-Italianism. So he bring the Wagner's musical language to enhance the French national opera. So it's interesting that he thought that the German nationalistic opera is the true French thing. So I think he saw the German nationalistic opera as not German, is French and nationalistic. So the anti-Semitic and the French nationalism and anti-Italianism is also incorporated in his anti-Semitic opera and the music. I think I'm sorry that I can understand your question. And I think it's same with Wagner. Wagner's reception. People don't want to accept that Wagner is anti-Semitic figure. So Dindy is also same with that. But I read that some letter to Dindy's friend, Dindy wrote that the disgusting Jewish composers' influence, and I think that people should be accept the Dindy has had anti-Semitic thoughts, and music also music too. So it must be addressed again. Yes.
Thank you so much. Okay, come around.
It seems to me very interesting that this anti-Italianism, which is attributed to the Jews and not to Wagner, when you look at Wagner's early operas, they're all Italian operas, really, and it's a strange dualism that they were not considered in the way you spoke of anti-Italianism.
Yes, I think the Paris opera scene is the problem because they like the Italian opera, but Jewish composer wrote it. So anti-Italianism and the anti-Semitic is combined, and Dindy want to resolve that problem, so he bring the German things and think it's nationalistic. So that's the interesting point.
Comment, which is that Dandy specifically looked to Wagner to save French music from the Jews. One of the reasons he was a Wagnerian, I guess he liked the music, but one of the principal reasons he liked Wagner so much was he looked to Wagner as a kind of bulwark for French music, to redeem it from the pernicious influence of the Jews.
Thank you, Miseo. This was really interesting. This might be something you found already, but if not, it can be a suggestion. I would be interested to know if Edward Calonne has come up in your research on Dundee, because he was of Italian Jewish descent and running concert series right around 1900. And the Cologne concerts, he was famously not totally anti-Wagner. He was willing to program Wagner with French music, with like Debussy on the same concert and stuff. So if Edward Calonne if there's any conversation on him and Dundee in any way.
Well, I've heard the first time about the Calonne, so I don't know about him, but maybe concert series are linked with that, because in Scholar Control, the Dengdi make the concert program to get into the Wagner and the religious thoughts and philosophy. So concert series may be very directly to Dingdi's anti-Semitism. So
It would be interesting to see if Cologne was willing to program him. So that might be an avenue to look at, the Jewish reception of Dundee.
thank you for comment.
Thank you so much for this talk. I was really interested by your mentioning of Wotan and Siegfried as sort of this wandering figure. Do you see a connection? Like, I know there's been debate in Wagner scholarship as to whether Wotan is a wandering Jew figure. Was there that debate among French scholars? Did Dundee engage with that at all? Was that a debate that people were having already back then?
Can you help me? I think Wotan disguised as wanderer is symbolized as the wandering Jew, and many Wagner scholarships agree with that, I think. So Dingdi maybe know exactly it's the wandering Jew figure, and that means Dingdi saw the Wotan as the wandering Jew figure. So I think he maybe saw Wotan as the Jewish people, and additionally, in Flying Dutchman, Wagner's Flying Dutchman, there's a Dutchman. Dutchman is also a wandering Jew figure, and the literature that I focused on this talk has modeled on Flying Dutchman. So I think Dingdi exactly knows that the wandering Jew figure is something linked with the anti-Semitic thoughts of himself. So I think he knew that Jewish people knew that the Wotan Flying Dutchman can be interpreted as a Jewish people.
Any further questions? Okay, then let's thank Miseo.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Miseo. We now have the privilege to hear from Joseph Strauss, who is the Distinguished Professor of Music Theory at the CUNY Graduate Center, and will be giving a paper titled The Antisemitic Aesthetics of Stravinsky's Poetics of Music and Webern's Path to the New Music. Thank you.
I want to start by just thanking the organizers of this conference. This has been really informative, and it couldn't be more timely. Unfortunately, our subject always seems to be a timely subject. In its most common usage, anti-Semitism has been understood as animosity toward Jews. In this paper, however, I will take a broader view of anti-Semitism as something systemic, a set of ideas, including ideas about aesthetics, that is hardwired into European Christian thought. In David Nierenberg's words, Judaism, then, is not only the religion of specific people with specific beliefs, but also a category, a set of ideas and attributes with which non-Jews can make sense of and criticize their world. Nor is anti-Judaism simply an attitude toward Jews and their religion, but a way of critically engaging the world. What Nierenberg calls anti-Judaism, then, and what I will be calling anti-Semitism, has an aesthetic component. It's a way of sorting people and artworks into those that are beautiful and those that are ugly. An anti-Semitic aesthetic involving the condemnation of perceived Jewishness in music is directed not so much at actual Jews, but rather at the figurative Jew, the imaginary Jew, the aesthetic Jew, taking the Jew, in Ruth Hakohane's resonant phrase, as a devalued sonic aesthetic category. In talking about anti-Semitic aesthetics, I borrow a valuable idea from disability studies scholar Tobin Siebers, who defines aesthetics as the sensations that some bodies feel in the presence of other bodies. The senses revolt against some bodies while other bodies please them. These responses represent the corporeal substrata on which aesthetic effects are based. Today, I'll be talking about two central figures in musical modernism, Igor Stravinsky and Anton Webern. I will try to document the negative sensations that they evidently feel in the presence of Jewish bodies, that is, in the presence of musical works perceived as Jewish. I will show that both composers articulated an aesthetics of anti-Semitism. Both composers were personally anti-Semitic in various ways. Stravinsky's anti-Semitism has been thoroughly documented, mostly by musicologist Richard Taruskin, who writes, Stravinsky's anti-Semitism was of long standing and went deep. Derision of Jews was a lifelong feature of Stravinsky's private correspondence, especially with other Russians. Despite his benevolent relations with individual Jews, Stravinsky retained his accustomed contempt for Jews as a group. Stravinsky's longtime associate, Robert Kraft, argued for the closure of parts of the Stravinsky archive on the grounds that it contained evidence of Stravinsky's anti-Semitism so shocking that Goebbels might have written some of it. Stravinsky's anti-Semitism was bound up with his right-wing, anti-communist, pro-fascist politics. As a Russian of aristocratic origin, Stravinsky was deeply opposed to the Russian Revolution, which he resented as a Jewish plague, the work of, quote, Brownstein Trotsky. When the Nazis had banned his music, consigning it to the category of Entartete Musik, Stravinsky protested by affirming his opposition to Jewish cultural Bolshevism. Webern's personal attitude toward Jews involved less animosity than Stravinsky's. But while Webern maintained close associations with Jewish musicians, including his teacher Arnold Schoenberg, whom he revered, he was an ardent German nationalist who welcomed the Nazi rise to power, who admired Hitler, and who considered Mein Kampf enlightening. Mein Kampf has brought me much enlightenment. What I believe I see at present makes me supremely confident. I see it coming, the pacification of the entire world. At first, east of the Rhine, as far as, yes, how far? Probably as far as the Pacific Ocean. Yes, I believe this, I do believe, and I cannot see it any other way. In a slightly later letter, Webern invokes the idea of purification that plays a large role in his musical aesthetics, but here with reference to German military conquest and the special genius of Hitler. Though this is called unification, it is also absolutely indicates a process of inner purification. That is Germany today, but only under National Socialism, no other way. This is the new state for which the country has been preparing for over 20 years, yet it is a new country as it has never existed before. It is a new creation, a creation of the singular man. And I'm struck, of course, by all the exclamation points and the excitement. You know, this is a composer of very, very quiet, subdued inner directed music, but he's obviously very exuberant here in his delight at the Nazi state. Both Stravinsky and Webern wrote treatises of musical aesthetics that uphold values that I regard as anti-Semitic. In 1939, 1940, as the Nazis began their conquest of Europe and their extermination of its Jews, Stravinsky came to America to deliver the Norton Lectures at Harvard, later published as the Poetics of Music. This volume is basically a defense of Stravinsky's neoclassical style of composition, and it prioritizes certain aesthetic values, including order, tradition, purity, and unity. Stravinsky upholds these values in contrast to what he imagines as the cultural Bolshevism of a dissonant, noisy, deracinated, cosmopolitan modernism. Without referring to Jews by name, Stravinsky thus erects a musical aesthetic grounded in traditional stereotypes of Jews and Jewishness. A few years earlier, in 1932 and 1933, as the Nazis were rising to and seizing power, Webern gave a series of lectures to a small paying audience in Vienna, later published as The Path to the New Music. This is basically a defense of his 12-tone style of composition, and it prioritizes certain aesthetic values, including order, nature and natural law, history and tradition, and unity. As with Stravinsky, whose pro-fascist politics parallels Webern's Nazi sympathies, these aesthetic values represent a rejection of what, in the anti-Semitic imagination, comprises the sound of Jewishness in music. I want to talk now about Stravinsky's core aesthetic values, especially order, purity, tradition, and unity. Like all aesthetic values, these have to be understood in relation to their implicit opposites. In each case, I will show that the implicit devalued term is associated with traditional anti-Semitic understanding of Jews, Judaism, and Jewishness. For Stravinsky, order is a central value, and that word resounds throughout all of his writing and public pronouncements. The phenomenon of music is given to us with the sole purpose of establishing an order in things. A system of tonal or polar centers is given to us solely for the purpose of achieving a certain order, that is to say, more definitively form, the form in which the creative effort culminates. Stravinsky not only admired Mussolini, he wanted to be the Mussolini of music, restoring order to a chaotic, fragmented musical scene. This is Taruskin again. By the end of the 1920s, Stravinsky had consciously cast himself as the Mussolini of music, the dictator of the reaction against the anarchy into which modernism degenerated, in the words of his disciple Arthur Lourier, who wanted to do for modern music what the Duce promised to do for modern Europe. What is the source of the musical disorder to which Stravinsky's call for order responds? It is the cultural Bolshevism of Schoenbergian modernism with its noisiness, its formal chaos, its emancipated dissonances, in short, its various qualities that were widely understood culturally as emblematic of Jewishness in music. In the political and social realms, the concept of purity has alarming connotations of race-based exclusion and ethnic cleansing, and these carry over into the musical realm as well. For Stravinsky, purity means purging elements understood as extraneous, including programs and extra-musical references of all kinds, as well as distinctively national manifestations like folk music references and emotional self-expression. To be pure, music should be objective, universally and emotionally detached. It should be architectonic rather than anecdotal in Stravinsky's own formulation. Music itself should be thought of as a kind of pure form. The opposite of purity would be a sort of poison in the blood, the presence of an insidious parasite eating away at the healthy body, an infiltration, subversion from within, or an invasion, attack from without. In Stravinsky's view, this sort of impurity is a central problem in Schoenbergian modernist music, which violates the sanctity of natural law, by which Stravinsky presumably means presumably the conventions of traditional tonality. The music of our time, and particularly the music that calls itself and believes itself pure, carries within it the symptoms of a pathologic blemish and spreads the germs of a new original sin. The old original sin was chiefly a sin of knowledge. The new original sin, if I may speak in these terms, is first and foremost a sin of non-acknowledgement, a refusal to acknowledge the truth and the laws that proceed therefrom, laws that we have called fundamental. Stravinsky presents his vision of pure music and his contempt for impure music in language that is chilling and disturbing, especially in the context of the ascendancy of Nazism and fascism at this moment. Musical purity and racial purity are intertwined conceptually and bound up with political and aesthetic anti-Semitism. One of the hallmarks of Stravinsky neoclassicism is its close engagement with earlier music, especially the music of the 18th century. Neoclassicism thus defines itself as essentially conservative, preserving a tradition rather than revolutionary. It brings the past into the present and forges transhistoric and transnational bonds. Tradition is entirely different from habit, even from an excellent habit, since habit is by definition an unconscious acquisition and tends to become mechanical, whereas tradition results from a conscious and deliberate acceptance. The real tradition is not the relic of a past that is irretrievably gone, it is a living force that animates and informs the present. But the reverence for tradition very often entails a particular sort of exclusiveness, turning on who has access to the tradition and which traditions are worthy of upholding in the first place. Stravinsky distinguishes between a tradition that is in principle universal and fertile, grounded in an established order, and sterile cosmopolitanism. The universality whose benefits we are gradually losing is an entirely different thing from the cosmopolitanism that is beginning to take hold of us. Universality presupposes the fecundity of a culture that is spread and communicated everywhere, whereas cosmopolitanism provides for neither action nor doctrine and induces the indifferent passivity of a sterile eclecticism. Universality necessarily stipulates submission to an established order. Who are these sterile cosmopolites, unable and or unwilling to submit to the established order? Who are these deracinated outsiders who can only imitate, not truly belong to the tradition, and not truly able, therefore, to extend it? In the anti-Semitic imagination, it is the figurative Jew who has these attributes, the uprooted cosmopolite, always an outsider to the musical and cultural traditions shared by the true folk. Similarly, Stravinsky speaks of the period leading up to the Russian Revolution in strikingly anti-Semitic terms, implicitly blaming Jews for enslaving Russians with their materialism and revolutionary ideas. What strikes us above all is that the revolution came at a time when Russia seemed to have freed itself once and for all, at least in principle, both from the psychosis of materialism and from the revolutionary ideas that had enslaved it since the middle of the 19th century up to the first revolution of 1905. Stravinsky does not explicitly identify Jews as the cosmopolites, atheists, intellectuals, materialists, and revolutionaries who defile tradition. But the poet T.S. Eliot made the connection explicit and in strikingly similar language. The population should be homogeneous. Where two or more cultures exist in the same place, they are likely either to be fiercely self-conscious or both to become adulterate. What is still more important is unity of religious backgrounds and reasons of race and religion combine to make any large number of free-thinking Jews undesirable. There must be a proper balance between urban and rural, industrial and agricultural development, and a spirit of excessive tolerance is to be deprecated. Tradition, as both Stravinsky and Eliot use the term, is a code word for keeping out the Jews. Failure to do so will result in a loss of purity, and art will become adulterate. It will result in a sterile cosmopolitanism, a deracinated urbanism. In short, art and music will be rendered Jewish. For both Eliot and Stravinsky, letting in the Jews threatens a fatal loss of unity. Stravinsky imagines a remote time, the Middle Ages, when society and culture were unified, an image of Christian harmony. In a society like that of the Middle Ages, recognition by everyone of a hierarchy of values and a body of moral principles established an order of things that put everyone in accord concerning certain fundamental concepts of good and evil, truth and error. Social, cultural, and musical unity are threatened by modern composers who seek to subvert or shatter long-standing traditions. Our vanguard elite, sworn perpetually to outdo itself, expects and requires that music should satisfy the taste for absurd cacophony. Cacophony means bad sound, contraband merchandise, uncoordinated music that will not stand up under serious criticism. The use of dissonance for ears ill-prepared to accept it has not failed to confuse their reaction, bring about a state of debility in which the dissonant is no longer distinguished from the consonant. Again, who are these vanguard elites who treat musical sounds as merchandise to be bought and sold? They are the cultural Bolsheviks, the deracinated cosmopolites, the Schoenbergian modernists, the materialistic purveyors of noise, the perpetual foreigners to the sacred tradition, in a word, the Jews. This is what I mean when I say that Stravinsky, by asserting order, purity, unity, and tradition as his core aesthetic values, is practicing an aesthetics of anti-Semitism. When we turn to Webern, we find a set of core aesthetic values that overlaps, perhaps surprisingly, with Stravinsky's. In The Path to the New Music, Webern was centrally concerned with establishing the historical inevitability of his 12-tone approach as the culmination of the Germanic tradition. In the course of this argument, he articulates a series of core values, including order, nature, and natural law, history and tradition, and unity. For each of these positive values, we may wish to think about the opposite terms and their associations, the values that are implicitly ignored or suppressed. We might speculate about music that is disordered and impure, fragmented and disunified, that lies outside the great Germanic tradition, that thus violates natural laws. In many cases, these are qualities traditionally associated with Jews and Jewishness, especially as imagined by Wagner and other anti-Semites. When a pro-Nazi German speaks in 1932 and 1933 about order, law, and tradition and unity, we would do well to be sensitive to the dark implications of these terms. Webern imagines that he inhabits a political and artistic world that is chaotic or threatens to devolve into chaos. For Webern, all good art is based on rules of order, but the need for order becomes particularly pressing when there is a loss of central control, when the musical tones are threatening to go their own way. In Webern's telling, when music lost its sense of key, it fell to Schoenberg and his brave followers to restore order, ultimately with the 12-tone method. To be properly orderly, music has to follow the law, that is, the laws of nature. Art is not kind to people who try to live outside the law. All art, and therefore music too, is based on rules of order. Just as a researcher into nature strives to discover the rules of order that are the basis of nature, we must strive to discover the laws according to which nature is productive. And this leads us to the view that the things treated by art in general, which art has to do, are not aesthetic, but that it is a matter of natural laws, that all discussion of music can only take place along these lines. Music is natural law as related to the sense of hearing. Webern wants to think of the music he values and composes as in some sense natural, created according to natural law. In his music and in his thinking, Webern venerated the natural world, especially the countryside and mountains of his beloved Austria. His sacralization of nature suggests an aversion to nature's antithesis, the modern, degenerate city. In the anti-Semitic imagination, the Jew, cosmopolitan, sophisticated, deracinated, is the epitome of modern urban culture with all its ills, and the countryside, the soil of the fatherland, is a non-Jewish space. When Webern allies his music with nature, he implicitly detaches it from Jewish-inflected urban modernism. Webern seeks to position his music as the inevitable result of natural musical evolution within the Germanic tradition. Webern talks about that evolution in progressive stages and is strangely reliant on metaphors of conquest. What he calls the conquest of the tonal field involves diatonic music conquering modal music, chromatic music conquering diatonic music, and finally the culminating triumph of 12-tone music over chromatic music. This process, according to Webern, was both natural and necessary. So we see ever greater conquests in the field provided by sound. Now we shall see how these elements have gone on developing and have led to the last decade's new growth, composition with 12 notes related only to one another. People are wrong to regard it as merely a substitute for tonality. Here the element of comprehensibility is important above all to introduce ever more unity. That's been the reason for this kind of composition. Webern's principal claim for 12-tone composition was that it achieved an unprecedented degree of unity, and that its unity assured its comprehensibility all in accordance with universal natural laws. Composers tried to create unity in the accompaniment, to work thematically, to derive everything from one thing, and so to produce the highest maximum unity. And now everything is derived from this chosen succession of 12 notes, and thematic technique works as before on this basis. But the great advantage is that I can treat thematic technique much more freely, for unity is completely ensured by the underlying series. As with Webern's other aesthetic values, this insistence on unity seems ominous to me. Taruskin links Stravinsky and Webern in practicing a musical aesthetic that is aligned with totalitarian politics. Taruskin says Webern's aesthetic had become as dehumanized and impersonal as Stravinsky's. Like Stravinsky's contemporaneous parables of submission, Webern's musical utopias, the most orderly and disciplined worlds of music ever to have been conceived and realized by that time, seem in their tidy beauty of conception and their ruthlessly exacting realization to broach a theme that was on the mind of every artist then alive, the theme, ominous to some, inspiring to others, of art and totalitarianism. I would go a step farther. Not only do Stravinsky and Webern espouse and practice an aesthetics of totalitarianism, but they also espouse and practice an aesthetics of anti-Semitism, with some careful critical attention to aesthetic principles like purity, tradition, order, and unity. We can hear the resonance with anti-Semitic thought that represents Jews as the avatars of impurity and revolutionary disorder, and associates Jews with a degenerate modernism that threatens to destroy traditional societies. The personal anti-Semitism of these composers turns out to be not only an individual failing, but also an indicator of an anti-Semitic way of thinking about and making music. Thank you.
We'll take questions.
Thanks so much. There's so many insights in this presentation. So when you talk about unity, harmony, natural law, do you see the flip side of this discourse as well? Can you make an argument for these same exact criteria being used for example, just a few years later, the human rights revolution, right? And there's an emerging literature among human rights scholars as seeing this not just as a post-war liberal thing, but actually as a 1930s thing. So someone like Marco Duranti, who's looked at the conservative human rights revolution. So how do you sort of reckon this anti-Semitic, totalitarian aesthetics with the flip side? Is there a flip side to that, using the same criteria or the same terminology?
Right. I mean, a lot of the terms here can mean different things in different contexts, and that's why I've tried as best I can to put these things in the context of Webern's and Stravinsky's historical situation. I mean, take the 12-tone idea itself. It can mean lots of different things. I think for Webern, it meant something that aligned rather closely with his pro-Nazi politics. For Schoenberg, it didn't mean that very much at all. And for Dalla Piccola and Luigi Nono and other 12-tone composers, the 12-tone idea was meant quite the opposite. It was a liberation from totalitarianism. So the 12-tone idea is a very protean idea, and I suppose ideas like unity and comprehensibility and even purity perhaps can be as well. But in this context, in light of these composers and their personal and political commitments, I think that the anti-Semitic reading is entirely viable.
Mean that it's a tricky game to deal with the aesthetics as anti-Semitic.
Yes.
You have to make such a big distinction between Weber and Schoenberg.
Yes, it's a tricky game. It's one of the reasons I was praising Miseo a moment ago for her boldness in talking about pieces of music in which the word Jew is never explicitly mentioned. How do you justify reading Jewishness here. And indeed, the defenders of these people immediately emerge and say, well, you know, it's not really anti-Semitic, and some of his best friends were Jewish, and so on. And my feeling is, yes, okay, you know, there's no definitive proof that I can offer here. But since when are we humanists ever expected to offer proof of anything? You know, that's not our game. You know, it's not a court of law where we have a standard like, you know, be a preponderance of the evidence or something like that. We make arguments based on interpretive richness and persuasiveness. And I think that there's enough here, at least for me, to persuade me that not only is Dandy's opera L'Étranger an anti-Jewish opera. By the way, Dandy explicitly identified one of his other operas as an anti-Jewish opera. He never said that about L'Étranger, but I think Miseo is quite right to make that leap. And I hope that you feel I'm at least partly justified in making the leap here into Stravinsky and Webern's aesthetics.
Thank you. You focused on the use of terms, both in the words of Stravinsky and Webern. I wonder if their native languages is significant. So use words like order, unity, tradition, and we know we would understand that Stravinsky's Norton lectures would be in English, but that wasn't his native language. And I imagine that the Webern text of 1932-33 was
German.
a translation.
Correct.
From the German. So does that give it, were they using the same vocabulary? Can you speculate as to that?
I don't have a quick answer for that question. I mean, in the case of the Stravinsky Poetics, it's actually linguistically quite complicated, and the authorship actually of both of these documents is rather complicated. I glossed over that. The Poetics, to a significant extent, was ghost-written by Roland Manuel, a Jewish musician, in French, and it was translated then into English, I don't know by whom, so that Stravinsky could deliver the lectures in English, so it comes by way of French. The Webern document was based on notes taken by people who attended his lectures. And so again, there are intermediaries there, so the question of language that you've raised is really important, and I'm not in a position to answer it right now. But there's also questions of degrees of authorship.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating, if sort of disturbing stuff for music that I spent a lot of time listening and teaching about. Your talk got me thinking about Paul Hainbrick's book on the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism. And one of the interesting arguments he makes is that these interwar figures who were explicitly sort of anti-Bolshevik right-wingers found a weird home in the Cold War era when their anti-communism fit into a kind of Western anti-communist way of thinking or worldview. So I guess my question for you is, what happens with Stravinsky's aesthetics of anti-Semitism after the war? Do these arguments about order apply to his serialist works as well? Are there traces of this in the 40s and 50s and beyond?
That's a series of really interesting questions. So Stravinsky, after the war, eventually becomes a 12-tone composer himself, in his own way. And in that period, he actually are the only two instances where his music itself explicitly becomes anti-Semitic, in that he sets two anti-Semitic texts, once in the cantata from 1951, I think it is, and once in the sermon narrative and prayer from, I think, around 1960. So the anti-Semitism is there and actually percolates to the surface in his music, the only two times that it does so. How Stravinsky's 12-tone turn relates to the Cold War, what a great question. And he was always an anti-revolutionary. He didn't set foot back in Russia until very late in his life. His music had been banned there, in fact. So that animosity remained, I guess, refracted then through the Cold War lens. But you're asking a really interesting question that I can't fully answer.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for your paper, and thank you to the organizers for convening these sessions. So, Joe, I had question, I guess, that relates also to the question you posed to the previous paper. So this is a pedagogical question. So as a former student of yours taking post-tonal theory, Theory 7, etc., I only learned of Stravinsky's anti-Semitism through a private conversation with you. You didn't mention that in class, in any theory class. Same thing for Webern. I wasn't aware, so we were just taking in his writings, his wonderful, brilliant music, etc. So the question is, in 2025, what should people who are teaching, let's stick with music theory for now, do? So should these very disturbing attitudes be brought into the classroom, or are we talking about the notes and the serialism, etc.? I would say the same thing about Milton Babbitt, who, as we know, held homophobic views, racist views, and misogynist views. Do we bring them into the classroom and then talk about the music, or what do you propose? So that's my first question. The second part I'll just add in now. So you're drawing a line between these two composer authors' attitudes and their specific attitudes and these passages which are not marked specifically as anti-Semitic in terms of tradition, order, purity, etc. Might it be possible to enlarge the lens from anti-Semitic criticism of their anti-Semitism to applying it to something like racism? So in Stravinsky's case, for example, would you, or are you planning to think about these values, which aren't necessarily confined to anti-Semitism, but to larger, disturbing cultural and social
Right.
values?
In the case of Stravinsky and Weber, not confined to anti-Semitism, but when those two composers and other Europeans of their generation thought about race, they mostly weren't thinking about whiteness and blackness. They mostly weren't thinking about Africa. They were mostly thinking about Jews. That was sort of the preeminent racial category for them, and so I think I'm right to prioritize that. In terms of, you've asked me a personal question, I'll answer it in a personal way, which is that my attitude all along, until very recently, was the same as all of the other Stravinsky scholars and all of the Dandy scholars and all of Webern scholars, which was, okay, maybe he said a couple of bad things, but it doesn't, everybody back then was like that, and it's no big deal, and in any case, it does not affect the music. We erect a cordon sanitaire between the nasty language and so we see the anti-Semitism as a kind of personal failing. It's like, he cheated on his wife, or, it's like that. It's reprehensible, we don't applaud it, it's a personal failing, but it has really no bearing on this high art. And that was very much my attitude all along. Even Richard Cheruskin, who has been the most important figure in sort of foregrounding the political content of Stravinsky's and also Webern's thought, he says it doesn't really affect the music, except in those two instances I mentioned a moment ago in Stravinsky's texts. And I think that's wrong. I now have come to think that's wrong. I think it's in the music in all kinds of ways, and I don't have time to go into detail here about that now, but I think it's in the music in all kinds of ways. I think it's not just the writings that can be interpreted through the anti-Semitic lens, but a lot of the features of the music as well. So you then ask me, now so what do we do with that dark knowledge? And I don't actually know. I'm quite torn about it as well. You have to understand, I love this music. I spent my whole life thinking and listening and talking about it. And I find it deeply, deeply troubling. I will give you one quick example, which is Petrushka, okay? Petrushka, great piece. I've been thinking about and loving that piece for a very, very long time. In addition to its vicious racism, anti-black racism in that case, and its depiction of the Moor, who's one of the three puppets who come to life. There's also a figure of the magician, and the magician pulls the strings from behind the scene, and the magician, Stravinsky explicitly said, was of the Oriental type. Okay, so Stravinsky in his writing identified the character as Jewish, essentially. And every other character there has folk music, essentially, has music that's based on folk idioms, not the magician. The magician is denied access to the folk. The magician has slippery, creepy, chromatic music, very much like the stranger in Dandy, that mark him musically as Jewish in a very, very clear way. Well, what do I do with Petrushka? I love that piece. I think it's a great and historically very important piece. It is viciously racist. If you look at any, including very recent productions of it, the depictions of the Moor are horrifying and repulsive. And what do you do with the character of the magician? there's no way to redeem it. The anti-Semitism is in the music, and there's no way that even a clever director can take it out. So the answer to your question is, what do we do with this knowledge? The answer is, I don't know.
Thank you for a very informative talk. I want to ask you about the contemporary audience in the concert hall, their reaction to Stravinsky's music, especially with focus to the notion of order. I remember reading that when it was the Firebird, was first performed, that there was a riot in the concert hall, and people rushed out of the theater and did bad things. Is that accurate?
Well, I mean, it was the Rite of Spring that provoked the riot, and there's such a vast literature on that. Stravinsky had sort of three phases. He had this early Russian phase where he was closely involved with Russian folk traditions in various ways, most of which he kind of later tried to cover up, but it's true. The aesthetics I'm talking about here are mostly key to his middle period, his neoclassical period, where it's a kind of purification. I think of the music in that period as a kind of Jewish free space. He really, there's very little in the way of kind of direct reference to what I think of as musical Jewishness. And then the Jewishness comes back in various ways in the late serial and 12-tone music. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the reception of his music, in France, he was upheld as sort of the great hero of French values, clarity and directness, not like those hyper-expressive Germans. There's a whole nationalist thing here that plays out in very complicated and strange ways. So Dandy is a Wagnerian, and Stravinsky is an anti-Wagnerian. The only thing all these people agree on is that the Jews are bad. In Stravinsky's style? You'll have to talk to me about that later. That's a really, really big, complicated question. Yeah.
It seems to me that from a pedagogical point of view, the first important thing is to get your students to love the music. And that's really key. Just as if you were teaching theory, let's say, you would then explain to them why this particular passage is so wonderful and how it works and what the composer has done to make it work from a technical point of view, and then expand that to other things, to aesthetics. I think we all know great composers, great writers, great musicians, great dramatists who we never would want to have dinner with. And yet we admire their works or love their works.
Very, very deep question, and I think love is maybe a good word here, and love is often complicated. If you think about your own loving relationships and your own personal lives, very often they're not entirely pure. They're complicated in various ways, and their feelings often in a loving relationship, even the most harmonious loving relationship, of regret, of bitterness, and sometimes anger sometimes. And so, so maybe in that spirit I can say, yes, I continue, and this is an answer to Ellie's question as well, I continue to love this music, and I continue to think that music is worth teaching, and I continue to think that it's worth engaging students in a loving relationship with it, with the understanding that the love is always going to be mixed, perhaps in a very, very deep and conflicted way, with some rather darker kinds of emotions.
I'm native, my native language is Russian, and I love literature. So if I was really looking for anti-Semitic writings and reactions in personal life, I wouldn't read probably 90% of Russian literature, which I love. But I did sit with Stravinsky's archive before it went to Switzerland in Lincoln Center, and I did see, his letters from the 20s when he was mocking the, Jewish donors and especially Jewish women middle class who brought him to United States so he can make, make some money. He had a Jew in his family. His daughter was married
Yes.
to French
Yes.
Jewish, poet.
Yes.
And I don't think he did anything to get him out. He got out his niece, his granddaughter, but he didn't do anything to get, his son-in-law out, who was a widower already. So, he was really kind of probably not very nice person in many ways.
Yes.
Sorry, it's a
yes.
comment.
It's a very, very welcome comment because, these relationships are complicated, and Stravinsky's attitudes about Jews are complicated. He also, like Webern, had very, very close Jewish associates throughout his life. Arthur Lourier, who I referred to earlier, was Jewish. Roland Manuel, who I referred to earlier, was Jewish. He had a lot of Jewish close associates. So his anti-Semitism is complicated. The main point I'm trying to make here is that his anti-Semitism should not be thought of as just a personal thing, a personal moral lapse or failing. It should be thought of as a deep aesthetic commitment, one that finds its way into his thinking about music and into the music itself. That's the main point I'm making, is that it's wrong to cordon these things off as personal issues. Anti-Semitism, it turns out, at least as I'm currently thinking about it, it's not about Jew hatred, because it's not about hatred, which is a personal attitude, and it's not about Jews, actual, real Jewish people. It's about an idea of Jewishness grounded in an idea of a certain aesthetic values, the opposite terms of which are often associated culturally with Jewishness, and these are deep commitments that find their way into the music, and not just in an occasional chromatic gesture, but in rather deep ways. And to me, that's it's not about hatred, it's not about personal attitude. Anti-Semitism is an aesthetic commitment, and it's systemic, and it's very deep.
Just a very brief comment. This was such a fascinating and brilliant and rewarding talk to listen to, so thank you. My only thought was just that maybe loving music till it hurts might be a nice sort of way of framing this kind of question of what we do pedagogically in the classroom. It's something I come back to quite a bit, William Cheng's book, something I come back to quite a bit when I'm trying to grapple with institutional anti-Semitism and how all of these Jewish Americans could work for institutions that were founded on values of hating Jewish people but needed them. And they would work for them anyway, and it's the same kind of question of how do we grapple with the music, for all that it gives us, and at the same time for all the damage it can cause. So thank you.
Yes, thank you for that comment, and also for the reference to damage that's caused. In the dandy literature, which I referred to earlier, the main concern of contemporary scholars seems to be the damage that's been done to dandy's reputation. They're very concerned that this poor guy has suffered so much, so unfair, and I'd like to see more attention paid to the damage done by his decades of prominent teaching and influence in the case of dandy, and in the case of Stravinsky and Webern. Also, these are highly influential figures, and the anti-Semitism that I see is woven into their musical thinking and into their music. It's influential, and it's influential sometimes in harmful ways. And I would like that also to be sort of, added into the equation. So yeah, loving it until it hurts, except the hurt is right there at the beginning. It's woven in.
I'll take the opportunity to ask a question. Within the symposium, we're trying to think about these broader frameworks that we can use to think about anti-Semitism in music and sound. I think that the idea of anti-Semitism as an aesthetic commitment is an extremely useful idea that I think can be applied to many, many situations. And I want to think about sound here as well. I'm really struck by this idea of 12-tone music as the pinnacle of order. I'm not a scholar of 12-tone music, but having heard enough of it, this is very surprising to me.
Well, I mean,
yeah. So basically, can you help me to understand this this idea, and how do we kind of expand that into broader conceptions of composition, harmony, et cetera, when we're thinking about anti-Semitism?
Well, I mean, Schoenberg and Webern were inheritors of this long German Romantic tradition, where the idea was a piece of music should be a kind of organic growth, and everything should arise organically from a common seed, and the piece will flower in various ways, but everything has to go back to that sort of ur shape. And Schoenberg's term for it was Grundgestalt. And Webern had very much the same idea, that everything, that the best thing you could say about a piece of music was that it was unified, that every detail ultimately was related in some way to the generative idea. And as I acknowledged previously, there's nothing sort of inherently, right-wing or anti-Semitic about such an idea. It can move in lots of different directions and mean lots of different things. But for these early 12-tone composers, unity was really a cherished value. I mean, so Schoenberg famously writes about Brahms the progressive, and what does he like so much about Brahms? Well, one of the things he likes is the fact that even the secondary lines, the accompanying lines, are thematic, and Webern talks about that as well. The idea is that the motives penetrate into every aspect of the music, and that was understood as a deep aesthetic idea. And for them, the 12-tone idea, as Webern says, it assures the unity of the piece because everything's going to flower from this generative Grundgestalt, the series. That's the idea. I mean, 12-tone music has flourished in so many different ways, and the Schoenbergian and Weberian conception is very much not the only way of thinking about 12-tone music. But for them, it was all about unity and comprehensibility, and whether people experience it as unified and comprehensible, that's a separate question. Alban Berg, the other member of that trinity, wrote a famous essay called "Why is Schoenberg's Music So Hard to Understand?" And he wrote it before the 12-tone idea took shape, and the basic answer is because everything is thematic, because there's just so much stuff going on. There's no little Alberti bass figures that you can afford to ignore. Everything is thematic, and so it places tremendous demands on listeners that the unity is not necessarily immediately apparent because it penetrates into every corner of the work.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you for this talk. I just kind of want to open up this more to the broader, questions that we have right now in music theory and musicology. And in, I think, 2019, right, Philip Ewell gave his talk at Music Theory, Music Theory's White Racial Frame, and positioned it within Schenkerian. And then in 2020, right, that obscure Schenkerian journal published the response to it, unfortunately, right after George Floyd's murder as well. And I just want to ask you, where do you see your analysis kind of positioning it within this discourse as well? Because I think it's really propelling this question further, too.
I'm getting a lot of really tough questions here. And that goes, your question goes very much back to the question that Eli Hassama posed a little while ago, is, we acquire this dark, painful knowledge. What do we do with it? I'm not sure I'm ready for a clear-cut answer. I think the first thing we should do, however, is to acknowledge these truths and to acknowledge the depth of them. So, I think of myself as a Schenkerian and a 12-tone guy, and those are my own very deep commitments. And I don't want the first thing people think of when they think of Schenker or Schoenberg or Webern or Babbitt is to think of these things, but I do want them to think of it. And I want them to think of it not as merely a personal peccadillo, but as something that penetrates deeply into the musical thought and into the music. How we all come to terms with that, I think that's a very, very personal thing, a pedagogical thing, a matter for our individual consciousness, and I don't feel I've achieved for myself yet a clear sense of the proper way to be. The only thing that I absolutely am clear about is we need to tell the truth about these things and to acknowledge their depth.
Okay. Let us thank Joseph Strauss for the fantastic paper.